Albert Camus, The Rebel, an essay on man in revolt. Why do so many revolutions begin with noble ideas, only to create new forms of tyranny? Philosopher Albert Camus wrestled with this very question in 1951, after watching some of the century's most idealistic movements, from fascism to communism, descend into mass murder and oppression. This blink explores his famous philosophical analysis of the promise of rebellion and the danger of revolution. But this is more than a poignant perspective on 20th century history. In our age of political polarization and social upheaval, these insights offer timeless guidance on how rebels can challenge systems of power and keep their moral compass intact. Murder, meaning, and rebellion. The 20th century stands among humanity's bloodiest epochs. Fascist and communist regimes in Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union murdered millions openly and systematically. In these modern eras, killing shifted from acts of cruel or angry individuals to public, institutionalized, and justified phenomena. Stalin's totalitarian state apparatus enslaved people under the banner of liberation. Hitler insisted his genocide of Jewish people served as necessary self-preservation for Germans. Even after Camus' time, Western nations continued to wage war abroad in the name of freedom, democracy, and righteousness. This presents us with a massive moral problem. When killing becomes state policy, we all become complicit. So, as citizens of these states, it becomes our duty to ask ourselves, do we have the right to kill, or stand by while others are killed? Camus draws on his own philosophy of absurdism to answer this question. Absurdism holds that life has no inherent meaning, so we must create our own. Yet in accepting this challenge, we also accept the luminous truth that life matters enough for us to give it meaning. And if life matters for us, then it must matter for everyone. This leaves us with the recognition that murder remains as unjust as it ever was. So, what are we to do about it? Enter the figure of the rebel, a vital opposing force to the murderous powers of the 20th century. The rebel's primary function is to say no. No to violence, injustice, and oppression. The rebel reaches a breaking point where they're no longer willing to accept the status quo and are willing to give their life fighting to change it. The rebel's no carries within it a powerful affirmation. In rejecting their own degradation, they seek to protect our shared dignity. They stand in solidarity with the rest of humanity, asserting that everyone has the right to be protected from certain harms. That's why true rebels are willing to risk their own lives for the principles of rebellion. Yet at the heart of rebellion lies a striking paradox. Many of the totalitarian systems that killed so many people in the 20th century were created by people who were once rebels. Stalin was a young revolutionary fighting the Tsar. Hitler positioned himself as Germany's savior from humiliation and economic collapse. These rebels initially said no to oppressive powers, overthrew the old order, and then became deadlier tyrants than those they replaced. Let's find out why. The rebels who fought God. God is dead, German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche famously proclaimed in 1882. But who killed him? It turns out that Nietzsche followed a long line of rebels who challenged the most powerful overlord of all, the monotheistic Christian God. These metaphysical rebels weren't concerned with opposing a particular government or social system. They were waging war against the fundamental terms of human existence, including death, suffering, and the apparent meaninglessness of it all. Once upon a time, humans were willing to accept the chaos of nature as simply the way things were. The ancient Greeks, for instance, believed in many gods that were more like powerful, messy humans than almighty creators. When bad things happened for no apparent reason, it was blamed on ill temper or oversight. Gods are just people, after all. But once Christianity introduced the notion of an all-powerful, perfectly good God, evil and suffering suddenly became a moral scandal. If God is both omnipotent and perfectly good, why does he allow terrible things to happen? This question lies at the heart of metaphysical rebellion. The Enlightenment unleashed this rebellion in full force. In the 17th and 18th century, thinkers began questioning religious authority and seeking human-made moral alternatives. Consider the infamous Marquis de Sade, a French aristocrat who wrote scandalous pornographic novels like 120 Days of Sodom. Sade concluded that if God permits evil, then everything is permitted, including the sex, drugs, and rock and roll described in his books. The Romantics staged their rebellion through beauty and darkness. They glorified outcasts and loved flirting with the dark, demonic aspects of human nature. Writers like Lord Byron and Mary Shelley even birthed the archetype of the tortured genius, the artist who channels suffering into sublime creation. In 1880, Dostoevsky unleashed perhaps the most devastating attack in The Brothers Karamazov. His protagonist, Ivan Karamazov, becomes so sickened contemplating the torture of innocent children, their tears, their broken bodies, that he begins to reject God entirely. So when Nietzsche proclaimed God's death, he was signing the death certificate for a deity already murdered by 2 centuries of intellectual revolt. Yet metaphysical rebellion is not simply the negative, destructive force that Nietzsche's famous statement makes it out to be. These rebels were architects, desperate to build something better. They were seeking new, higher forms of order that would make sense of the injustice of the world, perhaps even alleviate it. For instance, Nietzsche advocated for transforming our new godless reality into an era of active self-creation in which humans must create their own values. Yet neither he nor his fellow rebels could agree on what those values should be. They tore down the cathedral but couldn't agree on the blueprints for what came next, and that failure would haunt the century to come. Why the metaphysical rebels fell short. So the metaphysical rebels had exposed the scandal, a supposedly perfect God presiding over a torture chamber. Their next move seemed obvious: overthrow divine authority and erect human-made systems in its place. Yet in pursuing this revolution, they often forged philosophical chains, more brutal than the ones they sought to break. Take the Marquis de Sade, who diagnosed the grotesque hypocrisy of divine morality with surgical precision. But his conclusion was drastic. Humans should reject morality completely and embrace evil. His morally liberated novels turned out to be more oppressive than liberating. They usually depict a handful of masters exercising absolute power over helpless victims with sadistic glee, prophetic sketches of the concentration camps and gulags that would follow. The Romantics ran into a different trap by turning rebellion into an art form, complete with signature black cloaks and practiced melancholy. This theatrical approach drained rebellion of genuine moral force. The Romantic dandy defined himself in opposition to society, yet required society's existence to rebel against. Even more troubling, Romantic literature glorified murder and destruction, preparing cultural ground for later political violence. Dostoevsky explored where these ideas led through his character, Ivan Karamazov. Paralyzed by the injustice of the world, Ivan comes to a conclusion similar to Sade. If God tolerates evil, then everything is permitted. But Ivan's nihilism has dramatic real-world consequences when his ideas drive his half-brother Fyodor to murder their father. The knowledge that his ideas birthed patricide shatters Ivan's sanity. Even Nietzsche, who attempted to solve rather than surrender to nihilism, prescribed a cure that proved deadlier than the disease. Though often miscast as a nihilist, Nietzsche actually sought to overcome the meaninglessness of existence by taking it to its philosophical extreme. If God is dead, he argued, then humans must create their own values through will to power, a drive for self-assertion, growth, and overcoming. This spiritual and psychological transformation would eventually create a superior Übermensch, or superhuman. While Nietzsche meant this figure to be creative and life-affirming, his ideas were easily corrupted by the Nazis, twisted into justifications for racial supremacy. All these failed rebellions follow the same destructive pattern. They begin with legitimate moral outrage at the injustice of human suffering. Yet by pursuing their logic with fanatical consistency, they gradually abandon the very humanity they meant to defend. Eventually, rebellion collapses into pure nihilism. Nothing has meaning except power. And with that, the rebel is prepared to become the very tyrant they oppose. From rebellion to revolution. The metaphysical rebels had traced the same deadly pattern, from righteous anger to nihilistic tyranny, from opposing power to worshipping it. But these were philosophers wrestling with ideas in their studies. What catastrophes awaited when their theories escaped into the streets? The French Revolution answered this question emphatically. Spurred by the philosophical ideas of the Enlightenment, the revolutionaries sought to transform French society in the image of new human values like freedom and democracy. When they beheaded King Louis XVI in 1793, the blade severed more than a neck. They were decapitating the old cosmic order itself, replacing divine law with the will of the people. The new French Republic they erected was based around the moral principle of virtue. In practice, this meant that every citizen should hold the public good above their private interest. The idea was popularized by revolutionary philosopher Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just. He saw the law as the primary instrument to guarantee the virtue of the French people, and since the law was the manifestation of perfect justice and morality, it could do no wrong. Pursuing this argument, Saint-Just birthed modern state terrorism. In his view, it was not only legitimate, but morally necessary to kill anyone who opposed the new republic and its revolutionary cause. His ideas culminated in the Reign of Terror, the intensely violent final year of the Revolution, and the subsequent rise of Napoleon. The French Revolution exposed a key flaw in the transformation from rebel to revolutionary. The rebel begins by protesting their specific instance of lived injustice. Yet once the injustice is overcome, the revolutionary seeks to remake the whole society in their image of justice. What's more, the same all-or-nothing thinking that propels the rebel into action eventually steers the revolutionary toward justifying violence. Russia would replay this tragedy on an even grander scale. Under Tsar Nicholas II, 40 million peasants languished in virtual slavery while their monarch ruled by divine right. But in the universities of Moscow and St. Petersburg, a storm was brewing. German philosophy, particularly Hegel's ideas, convinced young Russians that violence could be justified if it served historical progress. This new strain of Russian nihilism embraced radical materialism, rational egoism, and science. Traditional morality was just another chain to break. While the first Russian revolutionaries acknowledged that killing was evil yet necessary, this moral restraint proved short-lived. The next generation dispensed with guilt entirely. If the cause was righteous, then any means were sanctified, including mass murder. This philosophical groundwork would later be exploited by Stalin to justify his totalitarian nightmare, though few of these early revolutionaries could have imagined the monstrous scale of what was to come. The false choice between fascism and communism. By the mid-20th century, fascist and communist regimes had murdered millions. Their ideologies were supposedly opposites. Fascism preached racial supremacy, while communism promised universal equality. Yet both produced mass death, though through different logics and targeting different victims. How did opposite philosophies both end in catastrophe? The fascist movement chose a radical departure from reason itself, abandoning any claims to universal human values. Leaders like Hitler and Mussolini essentially embraced a perverse version of Nietzsche's nihilism. They held that everything is meaningless, and history belongs solely to those with the power to write it. This created a movement without fixed principles or ultimate goals beyond amassing more and more power, this making fascism extraordinarily dangerous. Without inherent values, it required constant enemies to define itself, fueling Hitler's aggressive expansion campaigns. Meanwhile, the Soviet war on human dignity embraced the moral absolutes of revolution, culminating in the rational terror of a totalitarian police state. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was based on Karl Marx's insight that economics alone explained human behavior and historical development. But Russia didn't match Marx's model. It was largely feudal, lacking the advanced capitalism and industrial proletariat Marx saw as prerequisites for revolution. Vladimir Lenin solved this theoretical problem through force of will. Rather than wait for historical conditions to change, professional revolutionaries would seize power and create those conditions themselves. The party vanguard would guide the masses toward communism, whether the masses understood it or not. This created the Soviet system's defining contradiction. Lenin, who'd initially promised to erode traditional state power, ended up building history's most powerful state apparatus. Like fascism, the permanent revolution of the communist USSR required constant expansion to justify its existence. The revolution could never end while anything remained to revolutionize, and revolution would be enforced by any means necessary. What rebellion can learn from art? After witnessing how rebellion transforms into tyranny, where can we find a model for revolt that preserves rather than destroys human dignity? The answer lies in an unexpected place: the artist's studio. Many great artists could be considered rebels, at least in the aesthetic sense, but more importantly, rebels can learn a lot from the sensibilities of artists. Upon close inspection, it turns out it's no coincidence that many totalitarian systems dismiss art as a perversion or waste of time. At its heart, art itself represents the purest form of rebellion. Think about it. Good artists are often society's most passionate critics, yet they create beauty from the world they reject, seeking to transform it into something better. Great artists do this by avoiding two extremes: pure formalism that completely rejects reality, and crude realism that accepts everything uncritically. Novels like Camus's own are a great case in point. Novelists create fictional universes that give meaning to existence in ways that chaotic reality cannot. In these universes, characters pursue their destinies completely, and actions have clear consequences. Through particular stories, the novelist captures something eternal about human existence. In this way, they achieve the blend of the unique and the universal that philosophers seek but rarely attain. This balance holds the key for political rebellion. Just as great artists never lose touch with lived reality, even as they transform it, true rebels must preserve human values while fighting injustice. When revolutionary movements abandon this balance, they become as destructive as the forces they oppose. The original life-affirming spirit of rebellion mutates into nihilistic murder or systematic oppression. That's why revolutionary movements, as they become totalitarian, often oppose art. It provides the kind of nuance that competes with their absolute claims. Art affirms the dignity of individual human life rather than exalting abstract ideals. Like the artist, the authentic rebel seeks transformation through careful creation. They refuse the seductive lie that tomorrow's paradise justifies today's cruelty. Rebellion means remaining stubbornly human, rejecting injustice while accepting our limits, fighting oppression while respecting the dignity of even our opponents. The rebel builds rather than destroys, creates rather than annihilates, always keeping human values at the center of their struggle. The main takeaway of this Blink to the Rebel by Albert Camus is that rebellion should never lose sight of the universal human values that initially motivated it. Rebellion begins with a simple no to injustice, yet it affirms shared human dignity rather than pursuing abstract ideals. However, metaphysical rebels like Nietzsche and revolutionaries like Stalin made a fatal error. Pursuing their logic to extremes, they abandoned the human values that initially motivated them. Both fascism and communism, despite opposite origins, ended in mass murder because they prioritized abstract ideals over individual lives. Like great artists who transform reality without rejecting it, authentic rebels must preserve human limits and dignity while fighting oppression, refusing the godlike ambition to reshape history through violence. Okay, that's it for this Blink. We hope you enjoyed it. If you can, please take the time to leave us a rating. We always appreciate your feedback. See you in the next Blink.